Elon Musk says a lot of dumb things for a really smart guy, and that's not surprising. Lots of brilliant people say dumb things on issues for which they don't have any expertise. But Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, so his dumb comments get a lot of attention. And his latest dumb comments have to do with the fact that EVs shouldn't be subsidized anymore. And it's really dumb because he basically built Tesla with government credits and loans and other subsidies. So now that isn't enough to comment on Elon Musk's dumb comments. But here is the reason why I want to talk to Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon from the University of Calgary about this, is because government support for technology development and diffusion actually has tremendous benefits to national economies. So welcome to the interview, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is something I've interviewed you about once before, and it had to do with Astra in Alberta and the government subsidies and support for the development of the oil sands industry. But the general principle here is that when governments invest in science, in research, in technology commercialization, early support for important industries, that's the basis on which national economies get built often.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the things, we can go through all of it, but one of the things that particularly struck me from the comments that Elon Musk made was this comment about, you should leave capital allocation up to the markets and government shouldn't get involved. When in fact, the Tesla manufacturing facility in California, the one that arguably sort of really started Tesla's growth into what it is today, was built on the back of a $465 million loan issued to Tesla by the Department of Energy loan program office. And so, either he has a very short-term memory, because this was back in 2010, or he's just really being disingenuous about this idea that, we hear repeated over and over by many different people that, government should stay out of business and they shouldn't pick winners. But if you go back and look through all of the, arguably, the majority or even all of the major successes in developments of new industries, there was significant government investment and government capital put up at some point, exactly because there's all kinds of, good reasons that private investors aren't willing to take that risk.
Yeah, it seems like Musk in particular is a proponent of the socialism for me and libertarianism for thee, kind of philosophy. And but Tesla is not the only business of his that's been subsidized. SpaceX has got government contracts. That's what's kept that business afloat. Tesla has received, I don't know how many billions of EV compliance credits and I think the total that he's received from government is close to $5 billion, which is not a small number by any stretch. So it's just a tad ironic when the world's richest man, gets a huge boost to his personal net worth from the taxpayers.
Yeah, I think that's right. I looked up the latest numbers. So just in the first quarter of 2021, Tesla made $518 million on the sale of regulatory credits within the kind of regulatory EV compliance market. And so again, I don't point this out to say that it's bad policy. I think these are, the loan program office of the Department of Energy and the approach to really, create systems that incentivize the adoption of EVs have been wildly successful for EVs directly, and as well as a number of the other types of technologies that the Department of Energy supported in that way. But I think there is this problem where, successes that are supported by this kind of government support, often the story somehow gets rewritten afterwards, right? And we saw that, in the example of Astra, where the first underground test facility was really funded 100%. So not even matching funds, but actually completely funded by government. And only after it worked was there a sort of retroactive buy-in by the corporations. And then you have, Musk kind of continuing that, as you said, with SpaceX. essentially all of the space technology that's based on is coming out of government investment into NASA over many decades. So, it's I think it's really problematic because it lends credence to this narrative that, governments shouldn't be involved and, all they ever do is waste money and things like that, when actually what it is a great example of how to design good policies, like the Loan Program Office, for example, that has, a few high profile failures that many people know about. But in fact, actually, not only did it sort of, launch a number of different companies, it actually also was successful in terms of making back the money from those lost loans.
Okay, well, look, we've had lots of fun now, bashing poor Elon with the truth stick. So we'll back off a little bit on that. But let's talk about the strategic reasons why government investment in technologies is important. So, and I want to make one point, which is, and this came through in President Biden's campaign leading up to the election. He said, look, China has overtaken us in key areas of the 21st century technology. So electric vehicles, wind and solar, batteries, those are the ones he mentioned. He said, America has to become competitive again because that's the economy of the future. And so I'm going to invest in, infrastructure and build back better and all of those things. And so competing with your global competitors, and that's a pretty good reason for spending public money on these kinds of initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, often people, we talk a lot about the sort of green or decarbonization version of this today. But it is really more generally a form of industrial policy, right? Of the state supporting the development and growth of industries. And, much like the literature and experience with industrial policy in the past, there's good ways to do it. And there's risk of capture by industry where you are just, sort of handing over money without a big benefit. And so I think that rather than, individuals or companies saying, well, we just shouldn't do this at all and it's not good, we need to have this more nuanced conversation about how do you create that policy in a way that is good? How do you, some of those principles of making sure that you're sharing the risk and the reward equally so that you don't end up with a government that's basically on the hook for costs and, doesn't benefit when things go well, for example, are really important parts about getting this right. But indeed, certainly, especially as we're in the midst of this transition or transformation where the energy systems and the sources of energy that power our, daily lives and our economy are changing very much. To me, that's clearly a space that we need to have government involved in because there's sort of too much at stake to simply leave it to the private sector alone, and too much risk of, not getting those kinds of big step change and big investments that you need to see, in particular, where you need to have government step up and provide some of that early risk capital, because otherwise investors aren't willing to come in at the scale that they need, especially when you're talking about some of these hard tech businesses, right? And sort of the shining counter example that we hear a lot about is really in kind of the IT and the tech space, the soft tech space, where, okay, you can, with relatively limited capital, develop a lot of companies or technologies. And so maybe there is less of a need for government investment in that space. But when you're talking about, the scale of investment that's required to build a big manufacturing facility or to, install the early stages of new energy generation technologies, that the scale of capital there simply isn't available from the types of VC sources that soft tech companies are going to.
Now, we've talked about industrial policy, and you've made the case very convincingly for government to be involved in one way or another in that. But then there's the other side of this coin, which is climate policy. And so we have negative externalities created by burning fossil fuels. We have the climate crisis imperative, where we need to stay within 1.5 C this century. And that adds, well, I would argue that alone is enough to justify government spending money on these new clean energy technologies.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, it's like two reasons for government support and maybe two different versions of it, right? So the climate version, or sorry, the early stage tech version still looks a lot like the industrial policy for whatever you're trying to achieve, but now climate becomes front and center. Then this idea that, well, there is a real cost to emissions and you have some kind of externality, that's where I think government funds, are justified in sort of a different way than typically they are. And there's different ways to do that, right? Of course, if you have a carbon price that's sufficiently high, that helps to build that in. But yeah, I think it's clear that there needs to be action taken for a number of different reasons. And again, then it's, in my mind, it's about being smart and doing that in ways where you're sort of able to achieve both goals at the same time. You're thinking about what do we need to do to decarbonize our own, footprint, say in Canada, for example, and then also how do we do that in a way that is creating a foundation of an economy that's going to help, make Canada prosperous in the long run in terms of really being able to produce the products and goods and services that the world needs. And those are related, but especially with a smaller country like Canada, we're not going to necessarily become leaders in all the types of technology that we need to decarbonize our own footprints. Some of that is going to be imported, but what are the ones where we can play a big role in going forward? And that's where you see that industrial policy like support.
Well, let's wrap up this conversation by saying that also government has gotten a lot smarter over the years. I mean, it used to be that industrial policy was simply, mostly writing a check, to subsidize a company. And now they're all, and I want to use a couple of examples of stories I've covered recently. So for instance, we see the carbon fiber grand challenge in Alberta, where, they took $15 million and that stimulated competition amongst various science teams to come up with ways to turn Alberta oil sands bitumen into carbon fiber. So that's a pretty low investment for create a whole new industry. And then out of the UBC, they have a materials lab that's supported by public money, and it developed a washable, stretchable, wearable battery that could, really contribite to the development of, or the advance of wearable technologies, like for medical reasons. And so we're not only just, industrial policy just doesn't mean cutting a check, we're also getting pretty clever with the way we use that money to stimulate innovation and support it.
Yeah, I think we are getting better at it. And I think if I had any criticism of Canada, it's that sometimes we go a little bit too far in trying to protect against losses, or really just relying too much on co-investment from industry in order to pick the projects that we invest in, right? And so you always have to walk this very fine line of course, we can't be going out so far ahead or away from, the expertise and knowledge that there is within our economy. But at the same time, there has to be some room for big investments that are made on big bets where you don't necessarily have, an industry partner that's willing to go, willing to invest at the same level. And that's really key, especially when you talk about these early stage developments of technologies and first pilots and things like that, being willing to take on more of that risk as a government, but again, in ways that are both ensuring that the reward is equally shared then between the public and private sector, or fairly shared, I should say, and also in ways that use other techniques to pick the types of technologies that are supported as well.
Now, I just do have one final question for you, Sarah, because you grew up in California, so you know American culture, and I've worked down in the U.S. And my observation is that by and large, Americans are more tolerant of business failure. In failure by inventors and innovators and entrepreneurs than Canadians are. We tend to be a little more conservative on that route. And it almost gives the Americans a bit of an advantage because they spend the money. And if it worked, it's fantastic. We build world-class businesses. And if we don't, shrug our shoulders, move on, let's do the next thing, not sit and wring our hands about our failure. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think there is some evidence that shows that Canadians are taking less risk in the investments that they're making, and that is problematic because, of course, when we're looking to kind of build out new sectors, that being willing to take less risks often then means taking less big steps away or looking closer for your adjacent competencies rather than trying something new, and so that's really quite important to enable that to happen. in a way that doesn't kind of constrain the flow of ideas or constrain sort of where people are looking. It's interesting because in some ways, you could argue that the Canadian society is actually better positioned with things like universal healthcare to support individuals who are willing to take those big risks. There's more of a safety net there to catch them. But that I think does actually also come back to some of the interesting literature that shows that the kind of investors or inventors in the States that are taking these big risks are often people that have their own safety net, be that through family money or others, that can help to cushion the blow if something does fail. And so there's a lot of different elements. I guess I just raised that because I think there's a lot of different elements to how you create the conditions to enable people to take risks. And that looks different depending on, what you have already in society today.
Sara, thank you very much. I always appreciate your insights and always interesting conversations. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.